Hello, and thank you all for joining us online today to celebrate the launch of Urban's new Disability Equity Policy Initiative, or DEPI. For those who may not know, DEPI is housed within the Urban Institute's Office of Race and Equity Research, and it has three initial focus areas: housing for disabled people, immigrants with disabilities, and the challenges facing disabled people living in rural areas. My name is Kim Leary. I'm an African-American woman with the pronouns she and her, and I have shoulder-length brown hair, I wear glasses, and today I'm wearing a striped shirt. I'm also the Senior Vice President of Research and Program Management at the Urban Institute, and my background is in both health equity and equity-focused change management. I concurrently sit on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School and the Harvard School of Public Health, and spent a year working in the Biden White House helping to implement the President's Executive Order on Equity. So it's a particular pleasure for me to be with you today and to be supporting this initiative and representing the Urban Institute. It's a great privilege to have all of you here with us today. Let me say just a little bit about the importance of DEPI. Due to ableism and structural racism in policy and in practice, disabled people have higher rates of poverty than their non-disabled peers, and disabled people of color face even greater economic hardships. We know the pandemic has certainly exacerbated these issues, exposing the shortfalls of too many of our country's support systems. But the full impacts of the pandemic are still not yet well understood. We're learning more each and every day. And undocumented disparities are still too often invisible to policymakers. This underscores the crucial importance of data. Throughout today's presentations, you'll hear how important rigorous, timely, and actionable research is for advancement, and the critical importance of data in supporting that research. This is the way that researchers, such as those at the Urban Institute, can address long-standing systemic inequalities. And the data that we're talking about today needs to be collected and analyzed in ways that enable disabled communities to become fully visible to policymakers and to our country at large. Through DEPI, we aim to bring a disability lens to our work at Urban, and to elevate also the expertise of disabled researchers. Throughout this event, you'll hear from nationally recognized experts on the importance of researchers advocating for disability inclusion in data collection and how to apply a disability lens and framework to all of our work. There is so much to be done. We look forward to partnering with you, and we thank you for showing up today to begin that work. Our talk today, our launch event today, begins with a talk by Rebecca Coakley, who is a disability rights activist and the first U.S. Disability Rights Program Officer for the Ford Foundation. After her talk, this will be followed by two panels and a concluding Q&A session. The very first of our panels will focus on how to ensure that disability is part of equity research. And the second will focus on doing research that changes people's lives. During these conversations, we hope that you will be part of the dialogue. You may send your questions or comments to Zoom's Q&A feature, and we will go through as many of these questions as possible during the Q&A sections of this event and during the concluding part of the session, where we will spend as much time as we have answering remaining questions. So without further ado, let me introduce my good colleague and friend, Sue Hopkins. She is an Institute Fellow at the Urban Institute. And as you know, she is a nationally recognized expert on public and assisted housing policy. She serves as the lead of Urban's Disability Affinity Group and is the co-lead of DEPI.
Thank you, Kim, for the lovely introduction. As you said, I'm Sue Hopkins. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a white woman with glasses, and I'm wearing a gray jacket and a scarf that my daughter picked out for me. As Kim said, I'm the co-director of our new Disability Equity Policy Initiative, or DEPI, and I'm just very excited to be launching this today. I want to take a few minutes to tell you how we came to be launching this exciting new initiative and about my own journey as a disabled researcher at the Urban Institute. I'm the mother of a child with chronic illness and invisible disabilities, and I spent many years battling with schools and medical systems to get her the services and care she needed. Then I was diagnosed with Sjogren's disease about 7 years ago, and it became disabling when it began to cause degenerative neurological problems for me. I've been using a cane since 2017. And when I first had to bring it to work, I felt very uncomfortable because of the shame and stigma associated with disability. And it was hard, but I got used to it. But when Urban began its DEI work and its affinity groups, also about 7 years ago, I and others at Urban suggested that we try to organize a disability affinity group too. But at that time, there wasn't really bandwidth to take that on. By 2019, however, Urban's efforts were more evolved. And I would also say awareness of disability justice had grown, and we received support for starting our group, which was very exciting. Being part of the Disability Affinity Group has been a very empowering experience for me and for our other active members. We've successfully pushed for changes that have helped to make Urban a more inclusive place for staff with disabilities, and we can really see the changes. We see education and outreach as part of our mission. And last year, we brought in outside speakers. Last year, we were lucky enough to have Judy Heumann, the international disability rights activist, join us for an event focusing on the history and future of the disability rights movement. And during that conversation, we talked about how Urban should be bringing a disability lens to all of our work, the same way that Urban is approaching racial equity. Some of us had already begun thinking about how Urban could organize our existing work on disability, including the work that I and other colleagues were already doing on housing for older adults and people with disabilities. Kim mentioned I'm a housing researcher, workforce issues, and income and benefits. And the conversation with Judy was really a catalyst to begin that process, as well as to start reaching out to other organizations to figure out how Urban could bring its research capacity to help bring change, as we try to do with all of our work. Support from the Ford Foundation's new U.S. Disability Rights Program has enabled us to begin planning our new Disability Equity Policy Initiative, and we are just delighted to be launching it here today. As Kim said, we're starting with a focus on 3 areas: housing, immigration and disability, especially around long COVID, and services for disabled people in rural areas. But our goal is not only just to do new research or to organize our research and to have it be useful, but also to empower disabled researchers at Urban to do this work informed by their own experiences. Our new DEPI team is just getting started, but we've already formed a partnership with the Kelsey, which is a disability forward housing and advocacy organization, to conduct a disability analysis of the housing needs of people with disabilities. And I'm just thrilled that 2 of our partners on that work, Catherine Perez and Allie Kennington, are here with us today. You'll be hearing from them later. We are also contributing our research to the Disability Economic Justice Collaborative that the Century Foundation has organized. I'm very excited about the potential for Urban researchers to generate new work that will have meaningful impacts on the lives of people with disabilities. And I'm also very excited today to introduce Rebecca Coakley, a longtime disability justice advocate, and as Kim said, the first program officer for Ford's Disability Rights Program. I want to give credit to Rebecca for helping launch me on my own path as a disability justice researcher. When I called her 3 years ago to talk about some of the challenges I was facing, She gave me a push, or the push, that energized me to start planning our disability affinity group and now our new research initiative. And I want you to know Rebecca is so committed to doing this work, she is coming to us from the train this morning. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca.
Good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to be here with all of you today. I want to take a moment to thank the team at the Urban Institute, to Kimberly, to Sue, to the entire team. It is a pleasure to be here. My name is Rebecca Coakley, and I am the U.S. Disability Rights Program Officer here at the Ford Foundation. I have had the pleasure of being here at Ford for the last year and a half. I am a redheaded white woman wearing a black jacket and a white shirt. I wanted to apologize for my less than awesome background. I had a situation come up and I had to come to Washington, D.C. a day early. I wanted to acknowledge all of the disabled people that are in the space today. And I want to note that you count, whether or not you identify as disabled personally or professionally. I see you, and our community is infinitely strengthened because of your presence. As Sue said, she and I spoke several years ago when I first landed at the Center for American Progress about the significant need for an understanding of disability as an equity lens across the work in the broader think tank space. At the time, my colleague Rebecca Vallis and I had just started building out the Disability Justice Initiative. And everyone we talked to told us it wasn't the right time, that no one would fund us, and that we would be unsuccessful in driving any sort of policy change. They were so wrong. When I came to Ford, we decided to take that attitude and apply it to philanthropy. Our U.S. disability rights portfolio. We met with the disability community right off the bat and let them tell us what our focuses should be. Philanthropic investment in disability is so new. Frankly, we could have chosen to focus on just about anything. But what we heard from the community was overwhelming. We needed to build a field. We don't have a strong field in the disability community. We don't have trade associations. We don't have organizations at the nexus of race and gender and disability. We need change in the economic justice space. We need to drive change in terms of narrative. And we need to continue to bring our partners in philanthropy to the table. There is no equity without disability. No well-meaning efforts to end discrimination, eliminate poverty, or create a more equitable playing field are possible while disabled people are not included, able to. We are disproportionately represented in every marginalized community, and even more so at the intersections between them. The disability community has lived segregation from specialized education settings to community service programs and restricted employment. The demand of philanthropy, government, and other sectors is not to be treated as special. Government and foundations alike must fund efforts to develop housing proposals to ensure a supply of affordable and accessible housing. Funders exploring ways to organize efforts in criminal justice reform must remember that 60 to 80% of people behind bars include people with disabilities, including those who acquire a disability while incarcerated. There is no effective approach to reentry, abolition, or de-escalation that will be successful without disabled people at the table. Disability is a cause and a consequence of poverty. Even if a foundation is discomfited by the idea of putting up a neon sign that says "We fund disability," any philanthropic entity that addresses inequality or injustice in effective and comprehensive ways has to include disability. Any demographic data that is collected to understand populations must include disabilities if we're actually to get a real handle on true diversity in this country. The coronavirus surfaced many existing inequities, and the impact on the disability community was clear. More than a third of all deaths tied to COVID come from congregate settings. The number one cause of death for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is COVID. More than a third of people who have had the coronavirus are now living life with long haul COVID, a brand new category of disability that impacts over 20 million people in the US. It must change how we think, how we work, and how we live. This is a moment for calling on the need to ensure that disabled researchers are at the table. We continue to say nothing about us without us. And while it's cliche in social justice spaces, it's very personal to the disability community as it comes from the disabled anti-apartheid movement. And then stop. Or not.
Rebecca, are you?
Yes.
Oh, we can't quite hear you.
Can you hear me now?
We can now. Thank you.
Okay. I'm so sorry. This is less than ideal. I understand that. In the words of my boss, Darren Walker, this work is about embracing risk and reflecting honesty. Exclusion of disabled voices in the room is intentional, and the research and our field suffer as a result of it. It must go beyond perpetuating the erasure of gender, race, LGBT identities. It must go beyond creating space for only those who it's convenient to accommodate. All means all. Disability justice includes the tenet of leadership by the most impacted. A few weeks ago, I was asked to facilitate a panel of disabled researchers. The panel was all white. I have it as a requirement in my speaking contracts outside of my day job and within my day job that I refuse to speak on a panel or facilitate a session that is less than 50% disabled people of color. So I pulled the conference. Why? Because I see why we have no research on HBCUs and disabled students. I watch the absence of a disability lens on the discussions of the public charge or immigration policy, because I see the absence of disabled women being included in conversations on equal pay day. Because if we were in the room, you can bet for sure we would be pushing back on the existence of a sub-minimum wage. Together, we can meet the moment, center individuals who are the most impacted, and rebuild as a more just nation if we see disability as part of the continuing struggle for our full civil rights and liberties. We recognize that there is no justice that neglects disability. Thank you again to our colleagues at the Urban Institute, and I'm happy to turn it back over to all of you.
Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us today. We so appreciate your commitment to being part of this conversation And we thank you for joining us with those such important, critical words and a call to action. You know, when we think about equity, we're really talking about at least three different realms of endeavor. The first is values, and the second are the practices and procedures that exist in organizations and in systems. And then the third element are about the outcomes. And I think Rebecca reminds us that at each one of those different parts of what we think of as the equity ecosystem, from values to practices to outcomes, we need to really think about what inclusion means. And at each one of those, ensure that we are thinking about the disability community in terms of our values, in terms of the actual practices that we support, and in terms of the outcomes that our research and policy delivers. So we're going to talk now about how we, as a larger community beyond the Urban Institute, including all of you, are able to make sure that disability is a part of equity research. And I'm so delighted to be in conversation next with my colleague, Selena Barrios Milner, who is the co-vice president of Urban's Office of Race and Equity Research, and also Catherine A. Perez from Loyola Law School. And we'll be talking about this very issue of ensuring and what we can do to ensure that disability is integrated into equity research. May I invite Selena and Catherine to come on screen and to briefly introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Selena Barrios Milner, co-vice president of the Office of Race and Equity Research at the Urban Institute. I'm a Latina female and I use she, her pronouns. And today I'm wearing a black jacket and bright pink shirt. First time I'm wearing this shirt just for this event. So I'm happy to be with you all this afternoon.
Hi everyone, I'm Catherine Perez and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm a queer, disabled Latina woman. And I'm wearing glasses and a blue floral top. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being with us. Let me ask each of you a couple of questions, and then we'll to be able to take some questions from those who are joining us today. Selena, let me start with you. You have 20 years of experience in equity work. Can you talk about some of the intersections you have seen in your work between race and disability?
Absolutely. And I will share also that I'm a immigrant from Venezuela that moved at a young age to Cincinnati, Ohio, at a time where every form just said Black, white, and other. And so it was that experience of navigating spaces and systems that didn't have me in mind that really led me on my equity journey and my evolving equity journey as well, to make sure that we are being inclusive and representative of all of those around us. I worked at the city of Boston, both in immigrant advocacy as well as chief equity officer. And I saw often the intersection between immigration status, race, disability, and how those came into play. I think of a young student in our public school system who was Mexican descent, but he was Mexican. He was actually more American than most Americans. He was one of those people that the border crossed his family, so had been in the US for many generations and had a Spanish surname and physically looked, ethnically Latino. And he was flagged for needing English as a second language support, even though, as I said, he'd been American for more generations than this country has existed and had perfect command of the English language. And in fact, he had a learning disability, but was tracked in this way based on his race and ethnicity. The parents were not consulted, right? So it was just multiple systemic breakdowns that led to this individual for years being on the wrong track and not receiving the legally mandated supports. And so that's just one example where the intersectionality comes into play, and why we as policymakers have to take into account that intersectionality when designing systems and creating processes for constituents to navigate.
That's such a critical point that you've made, Selena. I remember during the Obama administration when I was working with the Council on Women and Girls, and we were looking at data on school expulsion and school suspension. And it wasn't until we drilled down into the data that we could see that girls of color with disabilities face the greatest rates of exclusionary school discipline. That makes such a difference in the policy and interventions that you describe. And when you layer onto that other identities, including experiences with immigration, we have to get more granular if we're really going to bring that kind of visibility that you mentioned. Catherine, you too have many years of experience, more than 15 years of experience, doing work that involves race, disability, and immigration. Can you talk about the intersections you've seen in your work across these different facets of identity?
Sure. So I am an attorney who went on to punish myself to get my PhD. So while I was doing my PhD work, and my dissertation is a very legal, historical, disability studies, critical race analysis. So really my research has to do with legal documents. But I quickly got pulled into the disability rights movement and disability justice space. And I quickly learned that there are a lot of critiques of the disability rights movement as being primarily white. And in response to that, we formed the National Coalition for Latinxes with Disabilities, which was an identity organization that created a space for us to do research, but also to celebrate the lives of folks who live at the intersection of Latinidad and disability. And in our work through, our acronym was CNLD because we used our Spanish name. In our work, we found a lot of distinctions between what the mainstream white disability rights movement and how they define disability and disability rights and their core issues and the issues that we were seeing our Latinx community care about. We were even seeing distinctions between people in our community not identifying as disabled or knowing about their disability rights, and also a difference between the disability rights community feeling a sense of pride and pushing the narrative of pride around a disability identity, whereas people in our community, a lot of times we entered the disability community through trauma. So negotiating that pride narrative with how we experience disability through trauma. So one of the big issues that we quickly started working on was immigration. So I've done a lot of work at the intersection of immigration, Latinidad, and disability. And when I started working with a lot of disability rights activists and policy folks, I also quickly learned that there was a deficit between this intersectional work. The immigration folks were not attending as much to disability much like I was just critiquing the disability folks for not attending to BIPOC individuals and immigration issues, right? So I just have one quick example. I know I'm taking too long, but
No, please take as much time as you'd like. Yes.
okay. So during the Trump administration, they talked about rescinding the DREAM Act. Well, I'm sorry, not the DREAM Act, DACA, right? DACA was the administrative executive order, and DREAM Act was a policy. So President Trump had been saying, well, I want to rescind DACA, but Congress should act to pass the DREAM Act if that's what you want. And so a lot of folks in the immigration community were coalescing again to ask for the DREAM Act to be enacted. And during that time, I interviewed, it was like 7 or 8 documented and disabled folks. So documented in that either they had received DACA or that they were DACA eligible and couldn't receive it. And the stories that they were telling me about their lived experience, I think deepened the understanding of the immigration community's call for to keep DACA in place or to extend the DREAM Act. And a lot of their experiences were that a lot of folks couldn't even access DACA because immigration attorneys' offices were not accessible themselves. They couldn't get access to like interpreters, for example. And then for folks who don't know, DACA or the DREAM Act would provide work permits. And a lot of these folks said that even if they had a work permit, there was so much discrimination in employment that they weren't able to get employment anyway. So this, and then lastly, the education requirements as well. I think for a lot of students in the disability community, or a lot of folks in the disability community, education is also incredibly ableist and discriminatory. And so DACA and the DREAM Act, is a very merit-based program that shuts out a lot of disabled immigrants. So just keeping these types of intersectional analysis in mind, I think will help with future activism and pushes for like more inclusive immigration policies.
Thank you. I think you both said that what's so critical in doing intersectional work is to remember that we are doing intersectional work. And that means thinking about and making room in research and policy for different concurrent identities, and for that to be an explicit and intentional focus of both research and policy making. Let me ask you a little more about research. And let me start with you, Selena. You were senior advisor to Boston Mayor Michelle Wu, and were the chief of equity and inclusion under acting Mayor Kim Janey in Boston. And you provided guidance to ensure that federal recovery funds were allocated to communities who were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about the research and data that you and your team used to determine who those communities were? And was there research that was missing? Did you need other kind of inquiry or data? Or would you have benefited from a different kind of research than you had at your fingertips?
Yeah, thank you so much. So, part of the way that we communities experienced the effects of COVID were the health impacts and the economic impacts, and those were pretty much from day one and severe, right? So we approached this, the response to the immediate crisis as both a health response and also an economic response pretty much from day one. And as a result, we looked, we had available data on race and income down to the neighborhood level prior to the pandemic. So we already know what are the areas that are going to be most impacted, both because of a more limited access to healthcare, more density in their living situations, as well as a higher saturation in the essential industries that were more front facing and more exposed to risk. So we knew sort of which were the geographical areas and the communities that we needed to really zero in on. In addition, we had real-time data from our health commission and our local hospitals on COVID cases, right? The daily tickers that were the grim reminders of each individual that was being impacted by this. And we also had state level data on unemployment requests. And we knew that all of this is going to be undercounting people who don't have an immigration status, and so who can't access, for example, unemployment benefits. We knew that we would be undercounting the intersection of, who lives in this neighborhood, who is also disabled, who is also a person of color, right? Like we didn't have the data that would capture all of those together. So we were able to quickly kind of zero in on specific sectors that we needed to keep in mind in terms of the economic impact, as well as specific communities in terms of the health impact, and going door to door, getting, when it became available, personal protective equipment or hand sanitizers or whatever we could get our hands on in light of the scarcity. And in addition, we sourced firsthand information through small business surveys, as well as standing up task forces that focused on health inequity and the pandemic response. So that was really important to hear directly from communities impacted about, so we have the data view, right? But then what are people experiencing on the ground, and what do they most need right now versus what do we think they need? So that was all really important. But I think we were able to get critical resources out, especially with the CARES Act, and then have a more thoughtful deliberation when we have more time to prepare for the American Rescue Plan. But just want to underscore the difficulty of data sources often not capturing immigration status, and that is also a way to protect our communities, right? So we understand why that gap is there, and disability status is also not often tracked in concert with these other data. And so it's really hard to do the right amount of an intervention or the right intervention without data sources being able to come together to represent people's intersectionality.
So thank you for that, and for also underscoring the challenge of both data privacy and data protection, but then without that data, then you're missing key information that you need in real time as you were working through the pandemic. I also appreciated your comment about lived experience and hearing from communities and trusting the data that people were sharing directly with you. Very, very important. Catherine, you're the inaugural director of the Coelho Center for Disability Law, Policy, and Innovation, working at the intersection of a PhD and a JD, which is great. I wonder if you could tell us, though, from your standpoint, in a different kind of research, where do you go to find the data and research on disability that you need, and what's missing from the policy and law research side?
Yes. So I mentioned that I'm doing historical legal analysis for my PhD. And that, I mean, I'll briefly comment on, I'm working on a new, a newish, this is a handful of folks who are working on what we call disability legal studies. So it's much like disability studies, but it's a subset of that, disability legal studies. So for that, I interrogate a lot of legal documents through a disability studies perspective. For my immigration work, a lot of the research that I've looked at still has a medical model perspective. So we're we're missing a lot of, and maybe let me define my terms here. A medical model versus, for example, a social model perspective of disability is this. So the medical model says that the problem of disability is inherent to the individual. So if the problem is within the individual, then the solution is that we need to fix the individual, we need to cure the individual, we need to provide therapies. And the social model of disability, which emerged from the disability rights movement of the 1960s and 70s, posited that the problem of disability was external to the disabled individual. So it was in our institutions that disabled individuals, and therefore the solution therefore was going to be to reform those institutions, right? So when I'm working on immigration and disability research and policy work, again, like I noted, a lot of the literature looks is through the medical model view, and also looks at individuals well, yeah, I'll just leave it there. It looks at individuals through the medical model, and what's missing there is the critique of institutions and how that they're disabling on the individuals. It also misses the immigrants with disabilities, their own stories and their own lived experience, and research that speaks to the research that talks directly to disabled immigrants. I also, through the Coelho Center, do a lot of work on pathways for people with disabilities to go on to higher education, and specifically to go to law school, and create pathways to have more disabled attorneys and judges. That's our ultimate goal, the Coelho Center. And we are missing a lot of statistics in terms of how many disabled folks are in law school and are attorneys. Some statistics have said we have between 1% and 3% of disabled law students, and some folks have statistics out there that 0.13% of attorneys are disabled. But we know these numbers are not accurate, and so we need a lot more research on that front.
So we need more research, and we also need to think about the research frames that we're using. A medical model frame or an individualistic frame is going to tell us about persons, and there may be value there, but you're also saying that until we look at the institutions and until we think about people in community, then we don't have all the data that we need. Let me skip ahead a little bit and talk about some of the ways in which in your positions, and this question will be for you, Selena, you've been able to begin to integrate disability into your work. So for example, I know, Selena, when you first started at the Office of Race and Equity Research, disability wasn't necessarily a part of that launch framework. Can you talk about how disability has become just central to ORER, the Office of Race and Equities Research, going forward?
Absolutely. When the concept of the Office of Race and Equity Research first came about, it was really important to center race in the conversation as such. Due to the original sins of the founding of this country, race is such a strong determinant of outcomes in this country. So it's important to center that work, but the vision was that equity was expansive, and there's a lot of intersectionality across all the different types of inequity, whether it's gender, race, immigration status, ability. And so we really look at our office as not a distinct policy area, but an approach to all policies. And as a result, it's important to take into account all types of inequity when we're looking at policy through an equity lens. And so to ground that a little bit more, if you're, for example, we have at Urban, we're organized by policy pillars, and there's a Justice Policy Center that focuses on justice policy. They recently wrote a blog about the intersectionality of being Black and disabled and being overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And so if you're not looking for that, then the types of interventions that you're going to design are going to be different, and they're going to likely not lead to the outcome that we all want. And so I think it's really important as we're able to gather more data to be more inclusive in how we do our research, that we design interventions taking into account the whole individual and not a part of the individual. And so that's really why we are really excited that this amazing initiative at Urban of the Disability Equity Policy Initiative now lives within our office and can really help integrate a disability lens into all of the equity work that we're doing across Urban.
We're going to get to Q&A in just a moment, but Catherine, I wonder if I could just ask you to address very briefly the question about the importance of lived experience. You've mentioned in other comments that it's important to include people with lived experience in disability research, not just as research subjects, but also as researchers. Can you speak maybe just for a minute or two about why that's so crucial?
Yes. I had an experience recently with someone I work with through my.
I think we've lost the audio, Catherine.
Oh, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now, Kim?
Yes.
Okay. So I mentioned at the beginning through my image description that I identify as disabled. So I have a number of psychiatric disabilities. And recently I was speaking with someone I work with, and well, one of my fellows through a fellowship program that I created. It's a pathway program for college students with disabilities who want to go to law school. And I am out about my psychiatric disabilities, in addition to being out by being queer. So one of my psychiatric disabilities is that I experienced OCD from a very young age, including scrupulosity OCD. And it's a very, well, that diagnosis, in addition to a lot of other diagnoses that I have, are quite stigmatized and very unique experiences. But definitely not so unique that these aren't experiences that other people have had. And although a lot of times it's hard for me to share and talk about my own struggles with psychiatric disability, I felt affirmed in doing so because I was speaking to, again, one of my fellows recently, and she told me that she experienced scrupulosity OCD as well. And that when she heard me talk about it, it brought her to tears and made her also want to be more open about her own disability. So it just, again, it just reaffirmed how important it is for, to have leadership that mirrors the experiences of folks with whom we're working. In this situation, it's director of a fellowship program, my fellow, one of my fellows. But in research, it's the same type of situation, especially when you're speaking to folks with lived experience. You're able to have more empathy and understanding, and it also, I think, disarms the folks with whom you're speaking.
It's often said that the purpose of leadership is to generate more leadership. And I think that's what you're also saying as well. That's terrific. There's a question, we're just going to take one question now and we'll come back to some of the other questions at the end of the session today. But I wonder, Catherine and Selena, if you might be able to speak briefly to advice or recommendations on how researchers can develop inclusive and effective definitions of disability as a prerequisite to being able to analyze data sets. Thoughts there about the definitional question? How can researchers go about developing definitions of disability that will be helpful to conducting research?
This is Catherine. So this is a very important and I think difficult question. I've definitely been involved with several different research studies where we start with the initial question is how do we even define disability to capture our audience. And I always have a recommendation on how to do that, but with every group of researchers that I work with, we've come up with, different questions with different options. And I don't think any is sufficient. But one thing I think more recently, when I was working with Loyola Marymount University in their question, their demographic question on disability, I stressed the importance of not only capturing the students within the disability services, because not all students with disabilities are registered with disability services. I also said we shouldn't just capture folks who have like a medical diagnosis or like a formal diagnosis, because there's a lot of folks for whom who don't have diagnoses and for whom maybe that speaks to sort of inequities for even getting a diagnosis, right? And then I also stress the importance of not only defining through like diagnostic language or medical terminology, but also identity language. So a lot of like newer generation not only identify as, a person with a physical disability or mental disability, but also define with terms like neurodivergent or CRIP or disabled. There's a big conversation about person first language versus identity first language. And even I was talking to someone the other day who was telling me that they identify as autistic, and this is just reaffirming what I just said, but they don't have a formal diagnosis and don't feel the need to even go get a formal diagnosis. So again, including folks who just identify as part of the community, but don't necessarily have that diagnosis. So, but it's difficult.
This is Selena. Just to add to Catherine's remarks, I think that similar to the comments that Rebecca made at the top of this event, that it's important that we are working with researchers and thought leaders that have lived experience and that are guiding the approach and the conversation. I also think that, you have to really focus on the specific population you're talking about and what specific issue you're looking at. And I think that the people first approach and really figuring out there's a huge disabled community, but what is the most relevant population to consult for the specific area that you're working on? Is it children? Is it, and I think that as long as you're close to the people, you can't go wrong. That's sort of my approach to policy work in general.
And this is Catherine. I want to say one more thing, because I was also working with the City of LA, their Department on Disability, also on a demographic question. And one thing we considered as well, and I think I talked about this with the Latinx disabled community, is that some folks don't identify as disabled or don't use disability language. So in contrast to the new generation that I'm talking about, who uses terms like quip and neuroqueer and or neurodiverse, it also is important to use like impairment language, right? Like if you have, physical impairments or mental impairments or medical criteria, because they might identify with that versus some of the disability language.
So again, speaking to the importance of inclusion and thinking about generational inclusion as well. So thank you very much for this very important panel and for sharing your experiences as policymakers, as researchers, as lawyers, as city leaders. We thank you very much, and we look forward to staying in conversation with you ahead.
Thank you.
So we will now kind of pick up on some of the themes that we heard in the last panel. I think what you heard from Selena and from Catherine is that when we're talking about research, we're not just talking about work that's done in a kind of academic ecosystem. We're talking about work that's done rigorously with a lot of methodology, but speaking to and speaking with communities and trying to make a difference in people's lives. So that ultimately is what most of us are here for. That is to use research and policymaking to make a difference in people's lives. And that's what we're going to take up next with our panel, to think about being effective by being effective not just within the scope of the research community, but being effective addressing the problems that are in communities, the challenges, and pathways to improving life outcomes for all. So let me introduce our next panelist, Bonnie Swanore from Johns Hopkins Disability Health Research Center. Welcome, Bonnie. And Allie Cannington from the Kelsey. And Sue Popkin will also rejoin the conversation, as she and Allie have recently collaborated on a research project, a prime example of research in collaboration with disability activism. So let me invite Bonnie and Allie to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon. My name is Allie, and I use they and them pronouns, and I am a white, queer, disabled person wearing aviator glasses, curly brown hair, and a blazer. And I'm really grateful to be here today. I'm a senior manager of advocacy at the Kelsey.
Hi, I am Bonnie Swanore. I am a white disabled woman sitting in my office at Johns Hopkins wearing a navy blazer. Really excited to be a part of this discussion. Disability data is certainly near and dear to my heart.
And Sue, welcome back. So Bonnie, let me start with you. Let me ask you a question about your work at Johns Hopkins Disability Health Research Center. Your work aims to shift the pattern from, or shift the paradigm, not the pattern, unfortunately, probably too often the pattern, but the paradigm from living with a disability to thriving with a disability. How does collecting comprehensive disability data fit into that paradigm shift in research?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. You know, that phrase, shifting the paradigm from living with a disability to thriving with a disability, really is all about creating a more equitable, just, inclusive world for people with disabilities. So at the Johns Hopkins Disability Health Research Center, we're trying to do that. We're working hard to do that through research, education, and policy efforts that are all led by and centered on disabled people, which is the conversation that was just had. At the core, we are very focused on data. You know, I founded this center because during my public health graduate training, I was really struck by the fact that there was a huge disconnect between the disability community, public health, which is where my training lies in, data science, and healthcare. And this really was conceptualized in the way that disability was imagined, the ways in which disability data was collected, or more frequently when disability data was absent. So addressing the inequities and injustices that impact disabled people really does come down to data in many ways. Data is needed to identify the inequities that are occurring in the disability community, to track the impact of interventions, and to support evidence-based policies. But when we don't have data and evidence, it's as if those issues and inequities that impact our community are non-existent, and we know that's not true. So at the center, we talk about how to count, you have to first be counted. So working to ensure people with disabilities are counted in data is so key. That lack of being counted has truly held back progress. And it's important to understand that that exclusion of disability data, people with disabilities from research, is not just by accident. It's not happenstance, but it truly does reflect the devaluing and stigma of disabled people across society. Our data has not been included because we've not been viewed as valuable enough to be counted, in essence. And that lack of comprehensive disability data impacts things like our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, limits our ability to close gaps in food and housing, education, limits opportunities to address economic inequities that are occurring across society and in people with disabilities. People with disabilities certainly have every right to thrive, but that's going to take addressing the injustices that prevent that from happening. And so data really is at the core of that. Data is the path and the roadmap to making that change.
Thank you. Well, you're really speaking to values too, what we value, who we value, and how we demonstrate value. Allie, what have been your proudest moments while working at the Kelsey? Can you tell us about your organization's successes and spaces you'd like to work on going forward?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is Allie again, and I just want to pause because I see that we have one of the ASL interpreters put their camera off. So I just want to pause for access purposes to see if there's another ASL interpreter who will be able to join us. So we're practicing live centering access for a second.
Yes, we are. So we will pause and we'll see if the team who's helping us out can give us an update.
Awesome. I'm happy to pause for a few more moments. Okay. Okay. All right. Actually, this is some of my proudest moments. Actually, are the moments we just had, where we practice our values of centering access, which is a part of equity. And pausing and making sure that we have as much as we need so that everyone can participate is a part of our daily work at the Kelsey and a part of the work that we've continued to do in partnership with the Urban Institute. We're really proud to have co-authored one of the inaugural publications for the Disability Equity Policy Institute. So it's actually those moments, those interactions where we come together as disabled and non-disabled people to pave the most equitable path forward. And it doesn't just happen in the products at the end of the day, but through the process. And at the Kelsey, our process of pioneering disability forward housing solutions is through both policy and practice. So on the ground, we are actually creating affordable, accessible, and inclusive housing for people with and without disabilities. And while we are co-developing that housing on the ground, we're identifying the market and policy conditions that need to change so that this type of housing can become the norm across the country. And we saw in our housing development work that it was difficult to make the case for funding or policies to really push people to invest in this type of housing And it's not because we don't know that it's needed. We know that disabled people across the country and our families are acutely impacted by the housing crisis. And yet our data is quite disjointed around it. And we felt that firsthand at the Kelsey, which drove us to partner with the Urban Institute on a fact sheet that will be released next week that will tell us an initial needs assessment of the housing needs of people with disabilities currently living in households across the country. And there's a lot more I could go into, but I'll pause there and say it's definitely a proud moment, but also an invitation, as you'll see in the results of the fact sheet, that we have a lot of work to do as a country to ensure that disability forward housing solutions are not just what the Kelsey is doing, but what the entire country is doing.
Well, it's terrific to hear about that forthcoming work and fact sheet, and please everyone look for it with its release come next week. Since we're lucky enough to have Sue with us here as well, let me pose the next question to all three of you. How can researchers and policymakers better partner with the disability community? And what are the pathways to including representatives from the disability community? And what makes for strong and effective partnerships? And maybe we'll start first with you, Bonnie.
Yeah, thank you. This is such an important question. Efforts around community engaged research really have expanded over the past few years in research. We're thinking very critically about who's collecting the data, what the data is being used for, and how that resulting information is being shared. And that's really coming from this broad recognition that communities that are facing injustices and oppression have to be a part of the process. But unfortunately, that application has not been brought to the disability community. And people with disabilities are still excluded, which has been discussed in this conversation. That has to just become unacceptable practice. And we all have to do our part in making that just an unacceptable norm. So partnerships between researchers and policymakers with the disability community are really needed to make sure this work is centered on the community, reflects the views of the community, and supports research that's actually addressing the things the community wants. I think Selena referred to this in her conversation. So to be better partners, there's work to do. There's steps that need to be taken. I think that researchers and policymakers need to really, the first step is understand the root causes or the reasons that these relationships haven't happened in the past. And to me, there's largely two things to learn about, which is ableism and gaps in accessibility, which we were just talking about. So so much of research and policy is built on ableism. Individual ableism, structural ableism. It's so baked in that even people who are doing disability research can be unaware that ableism exists in the work they're doing. This is a huge barrier to creating true and meaningful partnerships with the disability community and having community-informed research in this space. Gaps in accessibility and research and policy is also a huge barrier. There's this profound lack of knowledge and prioritization of accessibility. There's this viewpoint in research that accessibility really is for someone else to worry about. It's sort of this not in my backyard approach that just perpetuates the exclusion of disabled people as researchers, as leaders, as partners in this process. So to get to this place of inclusion and partnership, I think we have to do a few things beyond that learning. We have to think critically about who is an expert. And that will include challenging ideas that only academics and honestly only folks like me people with graduate degrees get to be the experts. That just simply is not true. Disability activists, advocates, community members can and should be viewed as disability experts. In so many cases, it's going to take researchers and policymakers to honestly and humbly unlearn what they think they know about disability and take the time to relearn from the community. That's also going to include ensuring disability is part of all diversity and equity efforts. I think Rebecca Coakley talked about this in her keynote. That's critical. And that's also speaking to the fact that we have to include disabled researchers, colleagues, leaders, board and committee members. These things are all related to creating these partnerships and environments that foster them. And then the last thing I'll say is that we have to just really understand this is about power. We have to dismantle the power imbalances that have prevented these partnerships from taking place. So much of research and policymaking has been built on this lens of disability oppression. And we have to challenge that. We have to challenge this hierarchy to human life that really puts disabled people at the bottom. That's hard work. It's going to take time and some discomfort, but it is truly needed for meaningful relationships to happen.
Thank you, Bonnie. I think you have just laid out a very significant call to action for all of us, really to rethink basic processes, basic approaches, and to even take on the really crucial issue of rethinking expertise and including expertise from communities, not just as an add-on, but in more fundamental ways. Allie, let me ask you a question about that. Through your advocacy work at the Kelsey, you often interface with researchers, including our colleagues at the Urban Institute. What's your approach to collaboration with researchers from where you sit at the Kelsey? And what do researchers need to better understand if they're to be effective partners?
Thanks for that question. And I'll speak from someone who, although I've been an advocate in movement work for over a decade, I'm new to interfacing with researchers. And with that being said, I felt for my entire time advocating that there is a gap in data and research. And so to come together with the Urban Institute, I think has really distilled both my own preconceived notions about what is even available to us to study. Like the questions, for example, the questions that the Kelsey wants to answer are really because of the current landscape of data that's available to us. We really have a lot of work to actually change the data sets in order to get the answers to the questions. For example, we really want to take a deeper look at people with disabilities who are living in institutional and congregate settings and take a look at their housing needs, because our housing infrastructure has failed to provide the commensurate supply of housing that's needed for disabled people living in institutional settings. And yet there's no data source that can really comprehensively give us the housing needs of those individuals. And so I think coming into this work with humility, but also it was powerful to be able to conversate with the research and say, here are our lived experiences as an organization trying to do this work, the questions we have, how can we bring together our expertise, both of what's available to us as well as the gaps, to answer the questions that we can, and then to continue to push the field overall so that we can continue to change the data sources and continue to do the research to answer our questions. The last thing I'll say is that we had a phenomenal pilot community advisory board that really helped to shepherd this work. And I'll lift up the names of the individuals: Rima McCoy-Heighton, Catherine Perez, who you just heard from earlier, Jensen Carabello, Valerie Novak, Alan Hines, Sandra Connolly, and Lisa Mitchell. And all of those individuals brought critical expertise to the table. And yet there was, even for myself and my colleagues and peers, we really had to have some challenging conversations about, even in the initial analysis of the data, it was hard to understand and hard to really decipher what we wanted to lean into more. And so I just invite us to continue to think about, as we partner advocates and researchers, how do we create a bridge of language, of how do we explain things so that we can really get the most out of all of our diverse expertise, and not just the ones that are touted as the most academic or often kind of inaccessible to understand, to be frank. And so how do we distill it to the most important facts so that we can make the inspiring calls to action to actually change people's lives on the ground?
So I also hear you saying, Allie, that to make that change on the ground in people's lives, we have to be willing to ask difficult questions of ourselves and our colleagues, and not just at the beginning of a process, but to remain open to those difficult questions as we go through the research and through its analysis and dissemination. Sue, let me ask you very quickly, if you could just sketch out one or two suggestions of what, in an ideal world, collaboration might look like between researchers, policymakers, and the disability community, and then we'll move on to Q&A from the audience.
Well, I think Allie and Bonnie have said a lot of what I would say. I think our experience with the Kelsey was a big learning experience for everybody. It was our first time having a community advisory board of disabled people. But I think one thing that is different is most of the researchers on the project are also people with disabilities. And so we brought our own lenses to the table, and recognizing that we speak research speak and how to translate that. I think we learned so much from the people that Allie's already named them all. I was going to thank Catherine specifically but it really improved our work. And I think it's helped us lay the groundwork for what we want to do next, because we want to be able to use the big fancy data sets and the tools that are available, but we also want to be able to have them turned into tools that people can use to make change. And that, I think, is the part we're still figuring out.
So your audience is right with you on this set of questions. I'm going to tee up a question for you that we'll come to in just a minute, and because I want to give you a chance to think about it. We've gotten a lot of specific questions in the chat about what kinds of data and even what kinds of variables researchers should collect around disability. And if you have any ideas or advice or recommendations about that, please start thinking about those, and then I'll call on you before we conclude today. But let me ask another kind of question. If that's the forward-leaning edge, others are raising questions about research organizations like Urban. We often find that repackaging relevant research is a valuable way to promote policy change. Is there anything to be done with past research that was completed without an equity lens, where we don't have racial, disability, or other kinds of identifiers in the data set? What can we do with that research in the service of equity and inclusion ahead? And I will have anyone who would like to answer that question just identify yourself and take the mic.
Yeah, this is Bonnie. This is a wonderful question, an important one, because so much of the work already done has not used this lens. You know, my first response to that would be kind of a combining of what both Sue and Allie had said. Is I really think that as researchers, it's our responsibility to share the data back to the community. We don't do a good job of that as researchers. We particularly do a terrible job of that in sharing back to the disability community, because we don't think about accessibility and lots of other issues that should be considered, as well as making connections with the disability community. So what I think could be done is simply taking that research and finding ways to share it back to the community. The disability community is fierce. They will help us know what to do with it and how to best use it. It can be used as examples of, hey, where was disability data, or where was the disability community? That's powerful and that's important. But again, I really think that part of our job as researchers is to take data and give it back to who it belongs to, which is the community.
Can I just follow up on that?
Absolutely.
I mean, I think one of the things we're doing at Urban, and this research is part of that, is building a community engaged methods resource center and learning how to do this across all our work, not just work on disability. And I think it's a challenge for it's a challenge for researchers, it's a challenge for the field. And we need to, you're right, absolutely right. We need to be giving the data back to the people and not just extracting it and presenting it as if it came from, you know, the air or somewhere. And I think we're advancing.
So let me ask another question before we go to that data question and variable question that I mentioned just a moment ago. Again, for anyone, how do or how might disabled activists push towards equity and inclusion when so many of our systems we know are set up to maintain the status quo? What's your advice about how we can push for change in the face of the status quo?
This is Allie. I think for folks who are newer to the disability justice framework, there's 10 principles. And one of the principles is interdependence. And I think that it can be really isolating to be pushing for change alone. And so that's, you know, an example is like the Kelsey can't push for change alone, especially when it comes to building answering a research agenda. And so we partnered with you all at Urban Institute. I think, how do we practice really realizing that everyone at the table or everyone in an organization has a role to play in pushing the change forward, and that even those who may not identify as disabled or who are focused on other things actually are quite proximate to disability, and taking that time to connect with each other as humans and realize that we have to count each little win, or else all we'll see is the status quo, all we'll see is the losses. And so what are the different ways, both that we're familiar with as well as new ways that we can come together and think about what each of us can bring to the change that one is trying to make.
Thank you so much, Allie. So the big question is the data question about the specific kinds of data or variables that will move disability-focused research and equity forward. That's a big question. I know that you're not going to be able to say, go to this website or go to that website, but there's some perspectives that you might be able to share. And maybe this is a question to come back to for later in DEPI's life cycle, but let me just raise the question now since it's come up so often from our audience members.
I could throw out a quick answer since we only have a minute or two. Having just gone through this experience with the Kelsey and trying to do this needs assessment on housing, the fact that every federal data set uses a different definition of disability is a real problem. And that most of them exclude people who are living in institutions, also a real problem. And that all of these definitions exclude people who they're all set on ability to do activities of daily living. And they exclude people with learning disabilities. They exclude people with chronic illness like me. So we are missing a huge proportion of the disabled population. So
Yeah.
better measures, that's what I think.
This is Bonnie. I fully agree with that. And I know we're at time. Quickly, I advocate for what I say is a disability in all places data policy. So I think we should be collecting disability data in every place we're collecting data on race, ethnicity, age, gender identity. That allows us to also look at intersectionality and expands and broadens the places we are collecting disability data.
Bonnie, Ali, thank you so much for joining us here at Urban today and being part of this terrific conversation. We thank you so very much for your participation. And now with that, as we are really on our last moment of this wonderful event, let me turn the mic over to Sue Hopkins, who will make concluding remarks.
Which really is just to say thank you to all of you, to Kim, to all of our panelists, to everyone who helped organize this event, to our wonderful interpreters and transcribers. We couldn't be more excited about launching DEPI, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. And thank you so much for listening today.